Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So Phil, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you. Can you start off by giving us a little bit of a background as to how you came to study the sort of political situation in Africa in relation to the International Criminal Court?
So I really came to study the ICC through the longer term work that I'd been doing on justice issues and reconciliation issues in Rwanda. So I'm a Central Africa specialist. I've been working on the region for 20 years or so. And about a decade ago, I wrote a book on a very different process. I wrote a book on the Gacaca community courts in Rwanda. This was a system of village level trials in which Rwanda prosecuted about 400,000 genocide suspects over the space of about a decade. So I was very interested in local approaches to justice. And at the time that I was finishing up my work in Rwanda, the International Criminal Court was becoming a very important player in Central Africa. It had just arrived on the scene. It had started investigating cases of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity in the same region that I was already working in. But it was a very different type of institution. It was an international court, whereas most of my previous work had been on this community-based approach to justice. And so I got intrigued by this completely different institution. And also the ICC was a new player internationally. It had only been inaugurated in 2002, and it had chosen Central Africa as the region to cut its teeth. It had chosen countries like Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo as the places where it wanted to conduct its first ever in criminal investigations and prosecutions. And so I was intrigued by this new institution arriving, starting to deal with the kinds of issues that I was already interested in, but doing it in a way that was completely different from something like Gacaca, which I'd been looking at for a very long time. So, so that set me off on this course to get out of Rwanda, to start to spend much more time in Uganda and Congo, to try to understand how the ICC was going about its work, but more importantly, what kind of impact was it having on the countries of this region.
Can I take you a bit further back before you sort of got into the ICC work? And what was your sort of initial introduction into Africa? What drew you to doing work there?
So I'm Australian by nationality, as my accent probably suggests, but I was born in Khartoum.
Sudan.
So my parents were pulpit thumping missionaries in the 70s and 80s. And so I was born in Sudan, and then I grew up in West Africa. My parents lived in a little village in northern Ghana. I went to a missionary boarding school in Cote d'Ivoire. So there's a kind of an African connection within the family. But then as a university student in Australia, as an undergraduate student, I did a lot of work on reconciliation questions. So I'd worked with a range of religious and civil society groups on reconciliation, especially between the indigenous population and the white population in Australia. So I was interested in reconciliation questions generally. And I ended up getting a scholarship to go to Oxford to write a PhD on the Gacaca process in Rwanda, which was just beginning in Rwanda at that time in the early 2000s. And this kind of brought together, I guess, various strands of my personal experience, this kind of upbringing in different parts of Africa, my interest in questions around justice and reconciliation. And so then that led to doing years of fieldwork in Rwanda, a country that I go back to every year and have done for the last 20 years. Um, and so the interest in these issues, I guess, really has come about quite accidentally, through these kind of different streams of my own background. And then
Hmm.
I guess, like a lot of academics, what you find is that by the time you've spent a lot of time in one particular place on a particular set of issues, that's really all you know, and your expertise has almost defined itself before you know it. And so
Hmm.
I've stuck with this region. I've stuck with Central Africa over the last 20 years. I still have a fundamental interest in how societies are responding to mass atrocity. What are the things that national governments do, but also what everyday people do to try to grapple with things like genocide. How do people try to put their life back together? How do people get on with their life? How do they go back to their farms and try to be productive? How do they live with their neighbors after they've lived through these horrific atrocities over the last 20 or 25 years? And I'm continually amazed and fascinated just by the human aspect of all of this. There are big moral and ethical questions around things like justice and reconciliation. But at the end of the day, what I'm more interested in is the human side. How do individuals and communities get to grips with the things that they've lived through, and how do they try to map out a much more productive and harmonious future for themselves? And that's the human bit of all of this, I think, that keeps me as an academic going back to places like Rwanda, Uganda, and Congo to try to understand these issues much more comprehensively.
I think what's really fascinating about that is that it also challenges the narrative that's presented in the West, where these countries, whatever's presented, for example, Rwanda, whatever's presented to the average layman in the UK, for instance, is fundamentally about the genocide and about and there's movies about it and it's discussed in across the media. But it was fascinating to me about what you just said is the fact that there is fundamentally a human aspect to it all, and how things have changed. And what most people don't realize that Rwanda is a phenomenal story of success, post genocide.
Indeed, and in some ways that was my entry point, even to studying a place like Rwanda in the early 2000s, was that the country was being talked about in such negative terms. Here was this country that was completely devastated by the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994, and that it was a country that was just waiting for Western states to blow in and help rebuild them. And more specifically, the literature that I was reading in the early days said that the Gacaca process, these community courts in Rwanda, were just going to end up being mob justice. You couldn't trust everyday Rwandans to deal with these issues on their own terms. This was going to be a disaster. And immediately I was skeptical about that. I was skeptical that there was so much negative press, so much negative commentary about Gacaca before it even started. And that was what sent me off on a PhD project, to actually look at what was happening on the ground. And what I found in Rwanda was a completely different picture, that this was about local communities that had lived through these terrible atrocities, but were using this community-based justice process to try to grapple with the things that they lived through. And every single community in Rwanda, every single week for 10 years, went to these Gacaca hearings, heard evidence about genocide crimes, had a public discussion about who was responsible for those crimes, and what needed to be done to rebuild this society into the future. And this was much more creative, much more energetic than anybody, I think, was really talking about outside of Rwanda at the time. And I was deeply impressed by that. I was impressed by people's creativity, by their resilience, by their desire to try to rebuild their society. And they weren't hanging around waiting for outsiders to do it for them. They were doing it on their own terms.
Can you sort of shine a light more on what the Gacaca process was and how it looked?
So Gacaca was, I would say, a unique response to mass atrocity, in that it basically was a court system in which local people were the judges. So in order to be a Gacaca judge, you weren't allowed to have any formal legal training. You couldn't be a professional judge or lawyer. Gacaca was created by the Rwandan government, so it was state-driven, but then it was spread across the Rwandan countryside, and there were 12,000 courts at the local level overseen by these local judges, whose job was to get their communities together to gather evidence about genocide crimes, and in doing so to try to determine through a community dialogue who was responsible for these crimes, what kind of punishment should be handed down, but ultimately to try to build a dialogue, particularly between the Hutu and Tutsi communities. And to do this every single week for a decade through this very localized approach. And one of the big things that I found by studying Gacaca for that full 10 years was that this system became embedded in people's everyday lives. It was more than just a court system. It was a place where the community came together once a week to try to deal with the past so that they wouldn't have to deal with mass violence again in the future. It was more than just a judicial process. It was a social process. And it became something that people talked about and lived with every single day for the rest of the week. And so it was very different from a conventional court system in that sense. It was more of a socio-legal experience. And I wanted to understand that. I wanted to understand, obviously, the legalities and the outcomes for convicted perpetrators, but I also wanted to know, what did this mean for individual communities trying to get back on their feet and trying to deal with the animosities that were still there after the genocide. And that's why I talk about it as a human experience. It was more than just a legal or political process. It was a deeply human experience, watching Gacaca for that decade.
It sounds like fundamentally it was beyond just it being a legal process that you wanted to find someone guilty or innocent. It was more of a social dialogue. It was discourse to sort of overcome the conditions that led to them, in genocide.
That's right. And one of the things that was particularly complex about Gacaca was that it was trying to do a lot of things at the same time, because it was gathering criminal evidence and it was prosecuting individuals for their crimes. So it did have a very important legal outcome. And many convicted perpetrators went back to jail for very lengthy periods after Gacaca. But it was also a place for truth recovery. It was also a place where people could find out details about what had happened in the genocide. I mean, one very important aspect there was that Gacaca enabled genocide survivors to find out where their loved ones were buried. That's one of the big things that came out of my research on Gacaca, that it was very important, especially for genocide survivors, to get the testimony from perpetrators about where they had dumped the bodies after people were killed in 1994. And, most of my interviews were happening around 2003, to 2005, 2006. This was a decade after the genocide, and most of these survivors still had no idea where the remains of their loved ones were. They hadn't been able to exhume those remains and to rebury people in a culturally appropriate way. And that had caused a huge amount of trauma for people. Well, Gacaca was the process that was needed village by village to get that information out in the open. And then we saw the reburials of people. And I went to many reburials of genocide victims, especially between 2006 and 2010. That was a big part of my research. And, that was something that stemmed from the Gacaca process. It continued for years afterwards, and was incredibly important to people in an emotional and psychological sense. So, along with the legalities, along with the judicial aspect, that was something that Gacaca was doing. It was really affecting people's lives in this very personal and very important social sense as well.
Is that not an argument then that people left to their own devices, like African nations left to their own devices, or African tribes perhaps left to their own devices, would find something that is workable for them, as opposed to having the imposition of something like the ICC on them?
Look, to a certain extent, that is one of the big things that I found in my research in the last 20 years, whether it was looking at Gacaca in Rwanda or whether it was looking at the ICC in Uganda and Congo. It was that local governments in this region and local communities are fighting for the space to be able to deal with atrocities on their own terms. That one of the real frustrations of many actors in Central Africa is that they're almost told by the international community, you're not allowed to do things in the way that you want to do them. You have to follow international prescriptions. You have to accept the imposition of the ICC or a UN tribunal for Rwanda. And it's making it very difficult for local actors to assert their own sovereignty and authority to decide on their own terms how they want to respond to the atrocities of the past. I mean, to stick with the Gacaca example, when Rwanda decided in the early 2000s that it was going to use these village courts to deal with genocide cases, the international community went berserk. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International wrote these fulminating reports saying that Gacaca would be a complete disaster. Many international donors refused to fund the process because it was a different form of justice from what they were used to. And so in the early days, the Rwandan government ran and funded Gacaca completely on its own steam. And it basically said to the international community, back off, we're going to do this in our own way. And ultimately, one of the things I found in my research was that the Rwandan government was right to do so. The Gacaca had many problems and many flaws, but ultimately I argue it was a huge success. And it's part of the reason why Rwanda has not returned to mass violence. It's the only country in the region that has experienced a major conflict in the 1990s and has not returned to mass violence. It's quite remarkable. There's a story to be told about how Rwanda has managed to do that. And I think a big part of that story is Gacaca. But if Rwanda had listened to all of the international advice, it would have had an international tribunal. It might have had a truth commission. But all of that would have focused at the national level. It wouldn't have got down to the community level to deal with the hundreds of thousands of genocide cases. So there's a tussle going on here for who gets to control how societies deal with mass atrocities. And Rwanda is a story of an African country that wanted to do it on its own terms.
It's a phenomenal story. There's a couple of things I want to ask. I mean, just very quickly, what role did the Rwandan government at the time play in ensuring that these processes, were designed in a way to be communal and to impact the individual, as opposed to just present the country in a particular way?
Look, Gacaca was a massive risk for the Rwandan government. The Rwandan government had never done anything like this before. There was a traditional practice called Gacaca, which had been used for generations at the community level, but historically it only ever dealt with very low-level infractions, land disputes, family disputes, that kind of thing. So the Rwandan government was being very experimental when it decided to create the national Gacaca system that would deal with genocide crimes. And then what was interesting was that the government created this system of 12,000 courts and then gave a high degree of control to those local judges to run these court hearings week after week. So this is a state-driven process. It's a very political process because the state is involved at every step of Gacaca. But even a government as authoritarian and as well organized as the Rwandan state couldn't fully control 12,000 communities. It couldn't keep an eye on what was happening in those courts. And that was one of the things that I was fascinated by when I watched Gacaca was, yes, it was community-based and it was involving lots and lots of everyday people. But what was the role of the government in all of this? And I had a suspicion in the early days that this very powerful state would try to control the process, that they would step in and they would make sure that their own objectives were met every step of the way. And what I found was something quite different, that there was state imposition, but more often than not, local communities got to dictate how they ran these hearings and what their priorities were, which cases they wanted to look at, what the kinds of punishments that they wanted to hand down, the kind of dialogue that they wanted to run about how the genocide had happened in their particular community. And that was a very important feature of Gacaca. It was happening in a very difficult political environment, but there was a lot more citizen agency and a lot more citizen creativity than I think a lot of people expected. And I keep going back to Rwanda now. In fact, I'm going back to Rwanda in a couple of weeks for new field work. And one of the things that I continue to be fascinated by and that I continue to research is what happened in all of those communities where Gacaca happened. I'm going back to my old field sites, places that I've been going for 20 years because the impact of Gacaca is still playing out. What's remarkable in Rwanda today is that almost all convicted perpetrators of the genocide are back in their home communities living side by side with the survivors of their atrocities. Now, that is a remarkable picture. That should be combustible. The place should be exploding.
Absolutely.
But it hasn't. And Gacaca, I think, is a big part of that it got stuff out. And so I'm fascinated by that. That's one of the things I continue to go back to Rwanda to study is what's happening in the post-Gacaca environment.
I mean, I honestly don't blame you because it's for me, it's a victory to humanity in that that's able to take place in a time where everything is so extremely polarized and tensions are high everywhere. So I think it's phenomenal, and I've heard Paul Kagame speaking a lot, and he there's one sort of thread that is flows throughout all his conversations and talks, and it's trusting Africans to manage the affairs of Africa and trusting the African individual and sort of like embedding trust into the communities, which I think is a phenomenal idea. Let me move on to the ICC because I'm conscious of time and your book. Now, I have personally, my personal opinion on the ICC is very high because I just think it's a sort of a bogus neo-imperial structure. But what I want to ask you about the ICC, because obviously yesterday there was a headline about they've investigated the atrocities in Iraq, etc., and they found some evidence of atrocity, but they're not going to do anything about it because it's Britain, of course. So in that context, why is it that sort of African nations, especially in Central Africa, are sort of the easy targets for and the ICC?
Yeah. So look, I think what the ICC announced yesterday, in many ways, underlines something that I argue at the end of my book, which is that it has become increasingly difficult for African states, for African institutions to decide on their own terms how they want to deal with the atrocities of the past. In contrast to the ability of Western powerful governments that more often than not have been able to keep the ICC at arm's length. And I think what we saw in the ICC's announcement about the UK yesterday is precisely that in essence, what the ICC has said is, look, we have good reason to believe that that UK forces did commit very serious atrocities in Iraq, but we trust the UK authorities when they say that they're investigating these cases. Now, anyone in the UK who's been following these cases in recent years would know that there is very little happening in terms of UK investigations into those crimes. And quite to the contrary, the UK government has gone out of its way, for example, through the recent Overseas Operations Bill, to ensure that it legally cannot look at these cases. And yet we've seen the ICC say, no, it's fine, the UK can deal with these cases and we're going to back off. Now, in the African context, very few African institutions have been given the leeway that UK institutions have. And one of the things that I look at both in Uganda and the DRC is that there has been very little latitude given to domestic institutions to deal with these cases on their own terms. Now, there's one complexity to this situation, which is that in both Uganda and Congo, the governments in those two countries jumped into bed with the ICC and said, we are very happy for you to take these cases. Because those two governments calculated that it was in their interest to do so. They could get the court to deal with their rebel opponents and their political opponents, and they would be able to protect themselves from prosecution. But what's interesting in both Uganda and Congo is that while the executive might be saying those things, the judiciary and community groups are saying, you're wrong. We want to be able to deal with these cases on our own terms. So you've got the court system in Uganda and Congo, and you've got local communities saying, let us deal with these cases. We don't want the ICC. We want to deal with these cases on our own terms. So it's not as simple as to say that the ICC is just swooping in and stealing cases from Africa. It's doing that with the complicity and the cooperation of African governments, like the governments in Uganda and Congo. And I think what I'm arguing in my book is we need to go beyond what the likes of Kabila and Museveni are saying. And we need to listen to the Ugandan court system. We need to listen to the Congolese judiciary. And most importantly, we need to listen to local people who've lived through these conflicts and what they want and what kind of justice they expect. And more often than not, I'm finding in my research, those other bodies are saying justice has to be done domestically. It has to be done through other types of systems. And the ICC is making it more difficult for them to do that.
Absolutely. I think you point to so many interesting things in the book. And given your sort of real on the ground experience in Africa, I think you are in a fantastic position to sort of make these recommendations. So I definitely urge anyone that's listening to check out the book, because these are the sorts of narratives that we are starved of, and historically have been starved of, because we've been getting a narrative of how justice should be purveyed by the West, when there are successful examples that Africa can deal with its own issues. Where can people find you online?
So they can search for me at my staff webpage. So if they just Google Phil Clark SOAS, which is where I teach, that they'll find my profile. They'll find a list of my publications. I'm also on social media, so I tweet a lot about these issues around Central Africa and questions of justice and reconciliation. So
if you send me your Twitter handle, I'll sort of plug it onto the episode so they can get instant access to it.
Yeah, brilliant, Hussein. No, that's great.
Where the books is the book, I assume, is available on Amazon as well.
Yeah, the book's readily available. Yep, through Amazon, most other websites, or directly from the publisher, from Cambridge University Press. Yeah, the book's been in paperback for about a year. So yeah,
we'll link all of those, and definitely worth. Again, I urge everyone to take a look at this, because it's a conversation that needs to be had. Phil, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time, and I would have loved to continue this a bit more.
No, you're very welcome, Hussein. No, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about these issues.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.